train.
Ting.
Airport.
Is it
Here.
the
So.
Door.
Hola.
Waiting.
Back and we'll take you there.
Rain.
We drive
So we get up
on time. Now we're tired. Never run to. We
must shine.
together. We made it happen. Together. We saw it through. That's why we're pulled together. Whenever there's work to do. We're
the
so
Door.
and everyone come to see. We did.
But where?
We started. And that's
Come.
it's meant to be. Up
The
hills where she's fully chugging. There's so many sights to see. Through the tunnel, happily. So many places we could be. As we've seen across our island, people come from everywhere. Just to see the Prince
of
Sodor hanging proudly in the air. Together we made it happen. Together we saw it through. That's why we're pulled together. Whenever there's work to do. Thomas hasn't seen the answer. It had to get in the dream. From now on we